Have you ever just stared at a map of North America and thought, Alaska's shape is kind of weird? It's this enormous piece of the United States, but it's completely cut off from the rest of the country by Canada. Well, that border, that whole shape, it all came down to one single deal, way back in 1867. And that one decision is the reason our map looks the way it does today. But what if it went the other way? Let's dive into that.
Because what's wild is that this map, it wasn't a sure thing. It wasn't inevitable. It could have looked completely different. So for the next few minutes, we're going to explore an alternate timeline. We're going to imagine a world where the British colonies, right as they were becoming Canada, made a different call. A world where Canada bought Alaska. Just picture that for a second. No American panhandles slicing down the coast, cutting the Yukon off from the ocean. Just one continuous, sovereign Canadian coastline stretching all the way. Today, we're going to unpack the incredible, cascading consequences of that one simple, historical change. Okay, so to really get this, we've got to rewind the clock. We need to go back to the exact moment it all could have changed, the Alaska Purchase. This is what you'd call our point of divergence. The timing here is just fascinating. You see, 1867 wasn't just any old year. It was the year Canada was literally born. And at that exact same time, Russia was still licking its wounds from a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War, a war they fought against Great Britain. So they were broke, and frankly, they were really nervous about their powerful British rival living right next door in North America. And here's the absolute crux of it. There was no way, absolutely no way, Russia was going to sell to their bitter rivals, the British. And since Canada was still a British dominion, well, that meant they were out of the running. Russia was terrified the Brits would just come in and seize Alaska for free in the next war. So they did the next best thing. They sold it to their buddies, the United States, to create a nice, friendly buffer. Plus, you have to remember, the brand new Canadian government had its hands full. They were trying to buy the massive territory of Rupert's Land and build a cross-country railway. Their plate was full, and their wallet was empty. They just didn't have the cash or the attention span for the Alaska deal. So how does this one decision actually change things on the ground? Well, the first major ripple effect happens about 30 years later with the Klondike Gold Rush. In our timeline, it was a totally chaotic, international free-for-all. But under Canadian control, it would have been a completely different story. This table just lays it out so clearly. In reality, the main ports to get to the gold fields were in the U.S., so all that money, all that wealth, poured into cities like Seattle. In our alternate world, the ports would be Canadian, and all that cash would have flowed into Vancouver and Victoria instead. And law enforcement? Forget a few U.S. Marshals. The entire region would have been under the thumb of Canada's legendary federal police, the Northwest Mounted Police. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? The American port of Skagway was famously lawless, run by a gangster named Soapy Smith. But the moment you crossed the pass into Canadian territory, the Mounties were in charge, and it was strict, orderly peace. With a Canadian Alaska, that order would have stretched all the way to the coast. No Soapy Smith, no Wild West. All right, let's jump forward in time, into the 20th century. A Canadian Alaska doesn't just clean up the gold rush, it fundamentally changes Canada's role on the world stage, especially when the great conflicts of the century arrived. Take the Alaska Highway, for instance. In our history, it was this desperate military project thrown together by the U.S. Army in 1942 to defend against a potential Japanese invasion during World War II. But if Alaska were Canadian, that highway probably would have been built decades earlier, not out of military panic, but as a great national project to connect the country, just like the Canadian Pacific Railway. And this might be the single biggest geopolitical change of them all, the Northwest Passage. Today, there's this ongoing argument. Canada says the passage is its internal waters, but the U.S. and other countries say, nope, it's an international strait, open to everyone. Well, if Canada owned Alaska, there would be no debate. End of story. The entire passage would be undisputed Canadian territory, giving them a total monopoly on what's becoming a critical global shipping route. And get this, with Alaska's 1.7 million square kilometers added to its territory, Canada would actually leapfrog Russia to become the largest country on Earth. Now, that's not just a fun fact for a trivia night, right? That is a game changer. It would give Canada a superpower-level voice in every single global negotiation about the climate, about resources, about the entire future of the Arctic. Okay, so we've talked history, we've talked geopolitics. What about the money? What does this super Canada look like today, economically? Well, the country's entire center of gravity would shift, creating a brand new economic engine up in the north. The economic impact would be, well, just staggering. The new province of Alaska would almost certainly be the wealthiest province in the entire country. We're talking a GDP per person even higher than the resource powerhouse of Alberta. It wouldn't just be an add-on to the economy. It would become the nation's new beating heart. And here's why that would matter to every single Canadian, no matter where they live. Canada has this system called equalization, where the wealthier have provinces help fund services in the have-not provinces. The billions and billions in oil and mineral money from Alaska would pour into this federal system, directly boosting things like hospitals and schools in places like Atlantic Canada and Manitoba. And you know what comes with that kind of economic muscle, right? Political power. A lot of it. This new, incredibly wealthy northern province would fundamentally change Canadian democracy. And who calls the shots in Ottawa? Let's just look at the raw numbers here. Based on its population, a province of Alaska would get somewhere between 8 and 10 seats in the House of Commons. Now, to put that in perspective, that's more political clout than Newfoundland and Labrador and about the same as New Brunswick. It would instantly become a major player in federal politics. So who would these politicians be? Well, Alaska's political culture, very pro-resource development, very individualistic, it lines up almost perfectly with the Conservative Party of Canada. Sure, some cities or Indigenous areas might vote Liberal or NDP, but it's a pretty safe bet that in most elections, Alaska would send a big, powerful, right-leaning group to Ottawa. And all of this, it leads to one final, dramatic outcome. The birth of a powerful new political force, an alliance of Alaska, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. You could call it the AAA Alliance. This Western Bloc would be so economically and politically dominant that the historical power centers of Ontario and Quebec would be fundamentally challenged for the first time. Canada's entire political map would be redrawn. So from a tamer gold rush to a global superpower, it's incredible to think that a single land deal in 1867 could have completely changed the destiny of a nation. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other quiet little moments, what other historical turning points have had a massive impact on the world we're all living in right now?